In 1886, a photographer named Solomon Butcher arrived at a remote stretch of high plains in central Nebraska to do what he'd done hundreds of times before: photograph a sod house and the family who lived in it. But when he set up his camera, he was looking at something that appeared nowhere else in his collection and nowhere else in the state. It was 2 stories tall, and it was built entirely out of dirt. No one in the state had ever built a 2-story house out of sod before, and as far as anyone can tell, no one ever did again. The man who built it was standing out front with his family, posing for the photograph. His name was Isidore Haumont, and what happened to his house after he was gone might be the most unlikely part of this whole story. Haumont was born on May 29, 1820, in Belgium. And now, next to nothing is known about the first 6 decades of his life. There are no surviving records of what he did for a living, whether he had any construction experience, or what finally pushed him to leave Europe at an age when most men would have been settling into their last years, not starting over on a different continent. What we do know comes almost entirely from a single letter written years later by his nephew Jules Haumont, now preserved by History Nebraska. Isidore arrived in Nebraska in the spring of 1883 at the age of 63 and settled on a piece of land north of the small town of Broken Bow in Custer County, in an area known as French Table, named for the community of French-speaking Belgian immigrants who had homesteaded there. It was flat, it was treeless, and it was about as far from Belgium as a person could get. What Isidore found when he arrived was a landscape unlike anything in Western Europe. Custer County sat on the high plains of central Nebraska, nothing but grass as far as you could see in every direction. No forests, no hills worth naming, just flat land and sky. It was one of the most heavily settled areas on the Nebraska frontier by then, and nearly everyone who had claimed land there was building with sod. The reason was simple: there were no trees. Lumber had to be hauled by wagon for days, or shipped by rail at prices most homesteaders couldn't come close to affording. And even when you could get it, there was never enough. So settlers did what people on the plains had been doing for years. They built with what was under their feet. And now, the way these houses went together really matters, because every step of the process is what made building a second story so dangerous. They used a breaking plow to cut strips of prairie turf, 12 to 16 inches wide and about 4 inches thick, held together by root systems that had been growing and tangling for thousands of years. They chopped those strips into bricks roughly 2 to 3 feet long and stacked them into walls, 2 bricks thick, grass side down, with each row offset from the one below it, so the gaps didn't line up. If even one course was laid wrong, the whole wall could shift. A typical house was a single room, about 14 by 16 feet, with walls standing just high enough for a man to walk through without ducking, and it took about an acre of cut prairie to build one. These houses were never meant to be permanent. Families lived in them until they could afford something better. Most lasted 6 or 7 years before the walls cracked and crumbled as the roots inside them dried out and died. A well-maintained one might stretch to 20. The county would later earn the nickname Sod House Capital of the World for the sheer number of these structures that went up during the settlement years, and Butcher would eventually photograph over 1,500 of them for his massive documentary project. Nearly all of them are gone now, but the one Isidore Haumont built was still standing when a television crew showed up almost 80 years later, and a big part of the reason why is actually visible in the photograph. While his neighbors were putting up single-room soddies just big enough to get by, Isidore Haumont started stacking walls that wouldn't stop at one story. And to understand why that matters, you need to understand why it shouldn't have worked. Sod walls are incredibly heavy. At 2 to 2.5 feet thick, even a single story weighs a tremendous amount, and all of that weight is pressing straight down into the ground. Now double that. A full second story puts twice the load on every inch of the lower walls, and those lower walls are just packed earth and dead grass roots. The whole thing could buckle, crack, or just fold inward without warning. Haumont would find a way around this and every other problem that came with building 2 stories out of sod, and the house he built would end up outlasting nearly every soddy in the state. But at the time, the odds were stacked against him. The sod walls also shrank over time as the moisture inside them slowly dried out. Builders on the plains knew this, and they planned for it by leaving gaps above their window frames stuffed with rags so the glass wouldn't crack as the walls shrank. In a 1-story house, you could manage that. In a 2-story house, the entire upper story was bearing down on lower walls that were already shrinking under their own weight, and there was almost no room for error. Then there was the roof. Roger Welsh, who wrote the best-known book on Nebraska sod houses called Sod Walls, put it simply: if the roof failed, the house failed, because the only thing keeping the walls alive was the protection the roof gave them. On a 2-story building, that problem got worse in ways that no other soddy builder had ever had to deal with. And on top of all that, as a 2nd story needed a lot more wood for the floors, the stairs, the frames around every window and door, and a bigger roof, and on the treeless plains, wood was exactly what settlers were building with sod to avoid paying for. Anyone with the money and the skill for a 2-story structure would almost always just build a frame house instead. Haumont did it anyway. In 1884, according to Jules Haumont's letter, the house went up. Nobody recorded how long it took to build or whether Isidore had help, but we can make reasonable guesses based on what's known about sod construction. A standard 1-room soddy took about a week to build. The Haumont house was far larger than any standard soddy, with 2 full stories, multiple rooms, and an attached single-story section, and it would have needed several times as much sod, far more labor, and far more wood than anything his neighbors were building. It was a huge amount of work for anyone, let alone a man in his 60s working on the open plains. The sod was the hard labor, but the wood was where it got really complicated and really expensive. Every window and door needed a thick piece of wood laid across the top of the opening to hold the weight of the wall above it and keep the whole thing from caving in. The 2nd floor needed heavy beams running the full width of the building, strong enough to hold up an entire upper story made of solid earth, plus a stairway to get up there. And the roof needed to be big enough to cover a 2-story building and tough enough to take whatever weather Nebraska threw at it. All of that wood had to come from somewhere, and the nearest trees were miles to the east along the creek bottoms. So Haumont would have had to make trip after trip by wagon, hauling logs back across the open prairie, just to get enough material for the parts of the house that couldn't be made of sod. So what did it actually look like when it was finished? The best answer we have is the photograph Butcher took when he arrived at French Table in 1886. He had been working on his project for over a year at that point, traveling from homestead to homestead across Custer County with his camera, building what would become the biggest collection of pioneer photographs ever taken. He had already shot hundreds of sod houses, but the Haumont house was unlike anything else he ever photographed. The photograph shows a big, solid 2-story house with a steep roof and a chimney on one end. There are glass windows on both floors, which was unusual for a sod house, and a smaller addition off to the side with its own roof. Standing out front and posing for the camera are Isidore Haumont and his family, and the whole thing looks like a real permanent house that someone built out of lumber, except every wall is sod. Now here is the detail that matters most. The roof surface in that photograph appears to be wood shingles or boards, not sod. And that single choice may have been the difference between the house lasting 80 years and lasting 8. Most sod houses on the plains had sod roofs because sod was free and wood was expensive. But sod roofs were also the #1 reason sod houses failed. They leaked after every rain, soaking through and dripping mud onto everything below, and they absorbed water like a sponge. When they got saturated, they could double in weight, as loading thousands of extra pounds onto walls that were never built to handle it. Pioneer accounts describe roofs collapsing under exactly these conditions, bringing entire houses down with them. On a 1-story building, that was bad enough. On a 2-story building, a soaking wet sod roof would have been pressing down onto an upper story that was already pressing down onto lower walls that were already under more stress than any soddy was designed to take. One bad storm season could have started a chain reaction that brought the whole thing down. By going with a wood roof, Haumont got rid of the single biggest threat to his building's survival. It cost more, and it meant hauling timber from miles away, but it also meant that the most common way sod houses fell apart simply did not apply to his house. But whether he planned it that way or just got lucky, the result speaks for itself. That house outlasted him, outlasted everyone who ever lived in it, and it was holding up decades after anyone stopped taking care of it. And here's the strange part. When somebody finally did tear it down, that ended up mattering more than almost anything else in this story. That photograph is now in the Library of Congress. Out of every sod house in Butcher's collection, not one other was 2 stories. No other 2-story sod house has turned up in any county record or family account anywhere in the state either. And given how hard it was to build, it is not hard to see why. After Butcher took his photograph and moved on, the Haumont family stayed put, and the house kept standing. El Isidore lived in it for nearly 2 more decades, before dying in March of 1904 at the age of 83. He had spent roughly 20 years living in a house he built with his own hands, which already made it one of the longest occupied sod houses anywhere on the plains. But the house didn't empty when he died. Somebody else moved in. Jules Haumont's letter says the last person to live inside it was a woman named Marie Francois, described as Isidore's sister-in-law. She stayed for another 26 years after that. Now think about that. By the time Marie was living there, Isidore's son Joseph had already built a frame house just 6 feet to the east. Joseph had the money for a real house. He went on to become the president of the Security State Bank of Broken Bow. And right next to his bank president's frame house sat his father's old sod house, with Marie Francois living alone inside it year after year after year. There's no record of why she chose to stay in a house made of dirt instead of moving into Joseph's, and no one seems to have asked her. She died inside those walls on January 31st, 1930, at which point the house had been standing for at least 45 years. Jules noted that after her passing, the house sat empty but was still in good condition. And then it just kept going. Nobody was living in it, nobody was maintaining it, and yet decade after decade the walls held and the roof held. Through the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, through the Second World War, yes, through the post-war decades when the plains emptied out and small towns dried up and the whole homesteading era faded into the past. A house made of stacked dirt and grass roots, built out of a material that usually fell apart within a decade, was still holding together with no one looking after it. Whatever Haumont had figured out during the build, it was working long after he was gone. And then, so many decades later that it's almost hard to believe, someone pointed a television camera at it. In 1962, a historian named Dr. Robert Manley visited the Haumont house with a television crew from NET, Nebraska's public broadcasting network. The program was called Nebraska Heritage: Hidden Places, Ancient Places, and Manley filmed at the structure while it was intact, and the walls were weathered, and the plaster that had once covered them was long gone. But the sod itself was still solid, still load-bearing, still doing what Haumont had stacked it to do when Isidore was in his 60s. That footage is preserved by Nebraska Public Media and is some of the only moving video of the house that exists. This house was built when Chester Arthur was president, before Grover Cleveland, before Oklahoma was even a state, when the Wright brothers were still teenagers. And here was a television crew 78 years later, setting up cameras in front of a building made of stacked prairie dirt. Isidore was long dead, Marie-Francois was long dead, and the whole world that had produced the house had come and gone. But the house was still there, being filmed on technology that didn't even exist when its walls were first stacked. Most of the sod houses Butcher had photographed in the 1880s were long gone. This one had made it to the television age. And then, in 1967, just 5 years after Manley's visit, it was demolished. Some accounts say 1972, but what is certain is that after at least 82 years, someone decided the house needed to come down. Sod doesn't get carted off like lumber. Once the walls are knocked in, they're just dirt again. No one recorded why it was torn down, but what happened next is the part of this story you really need to hear. A few miles away in Custer County, near the small town of Comstock, there stood another sod house that had been built in 1900 by a family named Dowse. It was a single story, much more like a normal Nebraska soddy, and by the late 1960s, it was aging. When the Haumont house was demolished, the Dowse family noticed. They had just watched the only two-story sod house in the state, the only one anyone had ever documented, get knocked down and hauled away. And they understood that their own house, one of the last original soddies still standing anywhere in the region, could very easily be next if nobody did anything about it, so they saved it. In the early 1980s, the Dowse family led a full restoration of their sod house. They repaired the walls, stabilized the whole structure, and in 1982 they opened it to the public as a museum. 4 years later, it was listed on the National Register, and in 1990 the family received a State Preservation Award for their work. By that point, was nearly every other soddy on the Great Plains had crumbled or been torn down generations earlier. Today you can still visit the Dowse house, but here's what gets me about this story. None of that would have happened if the Haumont house had been saved. It took losing the only two-story soddy in the state to push someone into saving one of the last ordinary ones. The Haumont house couldn't save itself, but its destruction saved the Dowse house. And the only record that Isidore's house ever existed at all is a photograph in the Library of Congress, a family letter, and a few minutes of television footage from 1962. We don't know why he built it the way he did. A 63-year-old man with no known construction experience, no record of wealth, no obvious reason to attempt something that no one else in the state ever tried. His nephew didn't say. Butcher didn't write it down. And nobody from the 1880s seems to have thought to ask him while he was still alive. Whatever the answer was, it's gone now. And if you want to know what those Nebraska plains could do to the families who settled on them, we made a video about a blizzard that killed 235 people in a single afternoon, on a day that started warm enough for children to walk to school without their coats. That one's right here.